One. Good morning. I'm Phil Owen with Communities for Recovery. I'm a peer recovery coach, and this is Recovery Talk. And today I have my guest, Joy Rucker from the Texas Harm Reduction Alliance. Good morning, Joy.
Good morning, Phil. How are you?
Doing just great. So happy to have you aboard.
Thank you.
Joy was going to be one of our first guests, and when I was getting acquainted with Zoom, I had a little technical difficulty, so we had to postpone this one. So this is a long-awaited interview for me. So Joy, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and the Texas Harm Reduction Alliance?
So yeah, my name's Joy Rucker. I've been involved in substance use services, homelessness, HIV prevention since 1985, and have always felt like, as a result of the gift of recovery, that I wanted to give back to my community. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to be of service in the last 30 some years, to be of service to other people and help create access to services that had barriers. So I got introduced to harm reduction through HIV prevention, and it really resonated with me that I wanted to be able to help other people understand what that is. So
Sure. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. You know, when I think of the HIV epidemic back in the day, I was a person in my addiction. I was a DJ at many LGBTQ nightclubs at the time, and it was frightening.
Yes.
It was a very frightening experience, especially before people knew what it was.
Yeah.
I can remember at one time, a lot of the population thought that maybe ecstasy, which did not have the name ecstasy at the time, was causing this. And there was a scare over use. There was a scare over going out. There was a scare over sexuality. It was a nightmare. And then kind of it took shape. It became this thing where the community at large kind of pointed the finger at the LGBTQ community, and this is your fault kind of thing. And so I know we're going to probably touch on a little bit about language and stigma today, because I know you and I are both big advocates on doing some changes around stigma on many topics. But I just remember that being a very frightening time, and nobody really knew what was going on. And it kind of likens to the situation we're in right now. I see we have social media now, so I'm surrounded by a bunch of self-professed experts, but I'm not really sure where to get my news from.
Right.
And it's like, and Google has always been my friend, but it also could be your enemy. We have to be careful about what we read and who we listen to, and we're in a crazy time, if you will. So if you could you tell us a little bit about what harm reduction means to you, or even by definition, what is harm reduction?
Sure. So harm reduction is a set of principles and practices that are created to work with people that are currently using drugs. And so the idea is, how do you reduce the harm that's connected to their drug use? And it doesn't necessarily mean that people have to stop using. Abstinence is not part of the harm reduction plan unless that's the person's choice. So it's really accepting that people use drugs. They're going to continue to use drugs until they make a different kind of decision, but that does not mean that they should be excluded from receiving resources because they're currently using. And it's also, for me, it's a social justice movement. It looks at the structural racism and barriers that have been created in our systems to keep people out instead of bringing people in. And and so harm reduction really started as a movement of drug users that were saying, look, just because we use doesn't mean that we cannot get housing, that we should not have health care, that we should not have access to all the other services and resources that other people do. So I find it to be just on the continuum of the spectrum of recovery. It's where people are, and we try and meet people where they're at and have them identify what's the most harmful thing in their life and provide that resource for them.
You know, that's interesting. I'm very open about me being a person in recovery. And when I found recovery, it was very clear cut at the time that when you give up drugs and alcohol, you're giving up everything. And what I mean by everything is drugs and alcohol, because I continue to use sugar and caffeine, and most people continue smoking and using nicotine and so forth. But I went into a sober house, and that sober house told me, you cannot use drugs and alcohol. If you use one time, you're out on the street. For me, that ended up being helpful, because I think having those clear-cut boundaries, I didn't want to go back out on the street. I'd been homeless for a couple of years prior to that, living out of my car, which caused a whole other series of issues and that. But it was not very inclusive, is what I'm getting at. It didn't really include everybody. I went from one being a separated population of somebody that used and kept to my circle of friends because we didn't feel accepted by the community at large, into another population that didn't use or drink. And it just felt like these isolated groups.
Right.
But when I think about what maybe kept me alive to today, was I remember I'd spent a lot of my life touring as a musician, and another musician told me, he said, hey man, you got to slow down. No more than 3 days of any particular drug. You know, you're not going to last. And at the time I was like, wow, that's a weird concept. How does anybody just do 3 days worth of a drug? You know, but I also think that it kept me alive.
Mm-hmm.
Point where I was able to have the chance to go to court and the judge to tell me to go to rehab, to have the chance to do these other things and make these other decisions. And I think back on it, I was like, man, that was harm reduction.
Yeah.
That guy taught me harm reduction. So it's very interesting to learn. And I'm a big advocate for harm reduction. I love the work you guys do and the idea of it being inclusive and being person-centered. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but what would you like to do?
Right. It really has to be the person's plan. It cannot be pre-designed and you already have outcomes that you're moving toward, because recovery should be defined in a way that makes sense to the person that is defining recovery for themselves. And in harm reduction, it's any positive change is success. And that's what we're looking at. And we measure success by the quality of life. Has the quality of your life gotten better? Then that's recovery, that's success. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be abstinent to do that. And, and harm reduction is not for everyone. I mean, if you're someone in recovery and that's your way of having a better quality of life and that works for you, then you're not a candidate for harm reduction. But if you're a chronic user and you've been through treatment and 12 steps doesn't work for you, there has to be an alternative. And harm reduction is one of those resources.
Absolutely. And I think also, I think about, one, I was told you can't have moderation. You're a real addict, and I think for me, that worked because I'm full blown either way. I'm either going to be full blown doing everything and anything, or I'm going to be full blown about keeping my side of the street clean and keeping myself clean. And I don't even like taking a lot of medications that are recommended for me because it's just where I went with, you know, in my head, that's where my headspace is now. But
Right.
it's not there's not the same size fits all, you know? And I totally agree with that. And I think about my musician brothers that are in recovery, but they smoke weed.
Hmm.
But they smoke weed.
But,
But
but,
their life's great. You
right.
know? And to me, that's recovery. You know, I probably have more friends that have quit sticking a needle in their arm and still smoke weed than I have people that have lasted in recovery.
Right. But you know, if you look at, I mean, even your statement, I have friends that are in recovery, but they smoke weed. So, you know, that it's like it negates the fact that they're in recovery. And that's what we do. We make a distinction. It's like, well, you're in recovery, but
Right.
you do this. You're in recovery, but you're on medicated assisted
Right.
treatment. And I really don't think it's our call. You know, if someone says they're in recovery, that's enough for me.
Yeah.
You
I
know?
completely agree. I put those butts in on purpose
Yeah.
because of the respect I have for my fellow musicians and people in recovery that do smoke weed or do drink in moderation. Because I've known a lot of people that, well, a lot of people that have died and a lot of people that are lucky to be here. And unfortunately, I know a lot of people that don't consider themselves in recovery because they've been told or have heard time and time again that if you're smoking a joint or you can drink responsibly now, that's just not recovery because you're not sober, you know. And
Right.
it's a paradigm that it excludes too much. And quite honestly, for me, it's a thing of the past and an old way of thinking.
Yeah. 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 I think that we're just at a very different place, and people decide to live different lifestyles. And, you know, when I first came around in the recovery community, it was all or nothing. You know, there was no gray area. There was no, maybe you can use in moderation. And then when I think about my own use, and I think about everybody I know that's in recovery, all of us practice harm reduction on some level, you know. And what in 12-step language, they call it controlled use. But really, it's moderation. You know, you're trying to figure it out. You're trying to balance all of that. And so I realized I was practicing harm reduction long before I came into recovery.
Right. Do you think that when we call ourselves the recovery community, are we creating our own barriers for inclusivity? Um, you know, and I think about that. Do you feel like the 12-step community, for example, is going to embrace or is starting to embrace harm reduction? I know that medically assisted treatment has always had a lot of resistance in the 12-step community, and I'm starting to see it listen a little bit more.
Well, I think that the 12-step program and the principles and the tradition of any 12-step program really has no opinion on whether or not people are on medicated assisted treatment. It is the people within the 12-step program that have the opinions of people that are on medicated assisted treatment. Because in the literature, it doesn't say anything about it. It says, if you have a problem and you need outside help, you should go and get outside help. We are not experts. We are not doctors. Go see a professional. And so I think that people have their own biases, and mostly I think people get threatened, feel unsafe when other people come into the rooms that remind them of themselves. And sometimes we, you know, like we forget where we came from.
Yeah.
And I don't I don't consider myself to be in a recovery community. Um, I'm a person in recovery, but I have a huge, it's not the only thing that defines me in my
Sure.
life. So I have a huge community, and I'm a member in the harm reduction community. I'm a member in, the queer community, the Black community. So there are too many things that define me to be pigeonholed in the recovery community. I think that, we do. It is always about excluding people.
Right.
And it's such a challenge to be open-minded and be inclusive.
Yeah, I think it's important. The difference between, you said it so well. Yeah, it makes me think of the difference between being categorized,
Hmm.
identifying with oneself.
Right.
There's so many things that I identify myself with. And so categories really kind of they just put me in a slot, and oftentimes I'm that square peg in a round hole.
Yeah.
Where I find myself and I love my identity, but I resist being categorized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we talk about harm reduction a little bit, and I believe the audience can easily tell now we're both big advocates for harm reduction. So can you tell me what the Texas Harm Reduction Alliance does? What do you guys do? What makes up the Texas Harm Reduction Alliance?
So we were funded to create an overdose prevention drop-in center, which we opened in December. And we started out by doing outreach to opioid injectors and making sure that they had overdose prevention education, Narcan, they knew how to use it. Um, and if they needed any other kinds of mainstream services and they weren't connected, we would try and connect them with that. We were able to take some of our funding and pay for 5 weeks of medicated assisted treatment for folks, and then help them get on sustainable funding. If they chose long-term, if they chose medicated assisted treatment as their long-term uh, recovery process. And so that's what we do. And we do outreach to mostly homeless encampments where we find people that are unable to access other supports, mostly the Austin Harm Reduction Coalition, which provides syringe exchange. We found a lot of people in the homeless encampments couldn't make it to the van. So we started providing harm reduction services for them in the encampments. So that's how we got started. Yeah.
Great. So before COVID-19 took effect, you guys have a center, which I believe Austin Harm Reduction Coalition does not. They've always been stationed out of a mobile van.
Right, right.
That's one of the difference between the two.
Yes.
What might have somebody used the center for? Would they drop in to get help?
So people can drop in to get help, to get a cup of coffee, to get out of the elements, just come in, have a conversation. We have recovery coaches that work at the drop-in center. So if people need assistance with anything, our recovery coaches are able to help them get connected to whatever it is that they're needing at that particular time, whether it's food, whether it's socks, or housing. That's what our job is.
Right. I think sometimes you say recovery coaches. I think sometimes that can even be a little misleading. Sometimes, people think a recovery coach, what do they do? Well, they're going to drive me to treatment.
Yeah.
Or they're going to pick me up from treatment, or they're going to help me get a sober house.
Right.
That's not really what all recovery. That's some of the things recovery coaches might help with, but it's not all the things. How might a recovery coach work with somebody that's getting services from Texas Harm Reduction Alliance?
So how we work is because we're a harm reduction program. Is the recovery is defined by the person. And so if they say to us, look, I want to get on I want to get on medicated assisted treatment, then we will help them facilitate that. That's what the recovery coach will do. If they say, I want to continue on this, we'll help them to try and figure out sustainable funding. If they say, I need housing, then we look at housing as a harm reduction
Right.
intervention. So anything that the people we serve define as a need, then our recovery coaches help them figure out how to negotiate that system.
So if I came to THRA and I said, look, I need some help.
Mm-hmm.
Now I feel like I'm getting ready to go back to prison. I'm injecting drugs daily. I don't want to quit using, but I want to live.
Mm-hmm.
Something a coach might help me with?
So, I would say that a coach might ask you, have you considered medicated assisted treatment? Have you considered methadone? Have you considered um, Suboxone? Have you tried any of that? Which one do you think works better in your life? And then try to help people to get that.
Great. So how has things changed during COVID-19 for THRA? It's a different landscape out there with regards to service delivery for everybody, whether it's a treatment center, a recovery community organization, and I would think also for THRA. Can you tell me how that's changed a bit?
Right. Well, we don't have people come to the drop-in center. Um, and initially, when this first started, we cut our outreach days down to 3 days a week, and then we were only dealing with gatekeepers and secondary exchangers in the encampments, and that's generally someone that has the most influence in the camp, or um, they have an economic investment in what goes on in the camps, and people tend to come to them for other things.
Mm-hmm.
We would give them supplies and hope that they would give them out to everybody in the encampment. But as we continue to do this, we started to get complaints that a lot of times we'd give supplies to one person and they would not share it with other people in
Right.
the camp. So what we do now is, we go out, of course, we have our mask on and we have our gloves on. And now anybody that wants to come to the van to get services and get supplies, they have to wear a mask. And we're giving out hygiene kits. We're making sure people have soap. We just got a whole big thing of hand sanitizer. And as soon as I can find the small little bottles to put them in, which are sold out everywhere,
Right.
we'll hand those out. And we're handing out lunch bags, just a
Right.
sandwich and fruit. But everybody has to have a mask on when they come for
So
service.
did in the encampments, do they have access to masks, or is that a barrier? What is that?
That's a barrier. Most we go there, and before we had access to the mask, people would ask us if we had masks. But now we have a supply of masks. We one of the folks that visit our website, she donated 100 handmade masks for us. So we're now able to give out masks to any participant that asks for it.
Great. So THRA is is actively participating in trying to remove those barriers for populations that are in need.
Yep. I mean, we're just out there, and whatever people need, that's what we're going to do. That's what harm reduction is. It's like, oh, we see that now there's this new harm that we have
Right.
to address. So let's figure out how to do that and make sure people get what they need.
Yeah, that's great. You know, when I think the first time I saw you speak about harm reduction, and it may have been at the Austin area opioid work group, one of the things you said was sometimes making a connection just with a pair of socks.
Yep, that's it.
And I love that because it's not what I think someone needs, it's what they need.
What they need, yeah.
You know,
And it
and
may, if you, for me, it's about the engagement, it's like sometimes it's just about having a conversation like, how are you? What do you need? Is there anything I can do for you? And that's
absolutely,
it. That's it.
absolutely. So if you were able to look into your crystal ball and think what the future might look like, what do you think as we come out of the slow transition of coming out of COVID-19 and what the new normal, if there's such a thing, might look like?
Well, that's a great question. What I'm concerned about is that we're, especially in Austin and in a lot of the conversations that I'm in around homeless services, is there's a big focus on the homeless community, but there's very little focus on the subculture of that community, which are the people that use drugs.
Right.
And so anything that's being set up, like if the people are getting tested and then moved into the ISO wards or pro lodges, harm reduction services are really not being considered there. They are getting people on medicated assisted treatment if they want to, but I'm not really sure how you expect people that currently use to be isolated in a hotel and not go out. So I think that, like there's another level of services that we're really not talking about. And
Right.
and so that concerns me, and what we're trying to do is bring that to the forefront of all the conversations we're in. I think that this has just made us look at things in a very different way and how we have to adjust our services, and the need has not changed. In fact, the need has gone up. We've seen more overdoses. We've
Right.
seen a greater request for syringes. So people don't stop using drugs no
Right.
matter what.
I agree with you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I've got one last question for you. And that would be, if you could create your own flavor of ice cream, what would it be?
Well, it probably would be green tea and coconut.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Fantastic. That is fantastic. Well, Joy Rucker, thank you so much for being with us today. Texas Harm Reduction Alliance, it's harmreductiontx.org. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us. So be safe, carry naloxone, and be kind.
Thank you.
Much.